I feel night and day from 4 weeks ago when I first came into Pinnacle. In just 4 weeks, I feel like I got my life back. I feel grounded. I feel strong.
Today I have a very special treat for you. I'm really excited to share it, and I've been working on it for the past month. It is a case study showing exactly what I did, step by step, with a client where I got life-changing results. Michael was visiting Portland for about a month, and normally I don't take clients in 1 month segments. I like to have people here for an extended period of time so I can see them progress and adjust as necessary. So I said, okay, I see you're struggling with a lot of things, but let's see what types of progress we can make in a month and then do a case study on it. Michael had done all types of research for years on his own body and how he can improve it, but it really didn't lead anywhere, and sometimes it made him worse. So he didn't really feel comfortable in his body, and when he would make a change, something else would pop up. It was this game of eternal whack-a-mole, so to speak. But the most important things he was dealing with was he had some generalized low back issues. He had really overactive TFL muscles. His outer hips were chronically tight. And this is really common when someone has a forward pelvis. The TFL muscle, which attaches on the outside of the hip, gains leverage to become tight and concentrically oriented when you have a forward pelvis. The other thing he was struggling with in his lower body is his glutes always felt tight and he couldn't get them to let go. And this is very common with people who try to do a lot of glute activation exercises, and they try to squeeze their glutes over and over again because they feel like, based off of their research, that they need their glutes to work better. But oftentimes that just creates a lot of compression on the backside of the pelvis, and that's not the most optimal way to go. He also felt gripping in his six-pack abs. He felt like his abs couldn't let go either because, again, if you do a lot of research on the internet, they'll tell you that you need abs and glutes to help improve your posture and your movement. But if you're just squeezing them all the time, that's not allowing your body the freedom of movement that it needs. The thing he was struggling with in his upper body is that he had a really tight right shoulder, and that was feeding into some suboccipital or neck issues on the backside of his neck, and these things were oftentimes tied together. So if he felt one, the other would act up on him. And this was a very common thing, and he had a hard time doing many things with his upper body without feeling this take over. He couldn't even lift his arm above his head, really. One of the most important assessments was this Ober's test, and this is a test of how neutral someone's pelvis is. So in order for me to bring the leg all the way back and get it all the way to the table, which is the goal, they need to have a neutral pelvis. If it's really far forward or back, that's not going to allow me, let's say it's really far forward, to bring the hip all the way back and then bring it to the table because it's going to get stuck before I can get into full hip extension. His straight leg raises on both sides were very limited, and this is a test of how much pelvic internal rotation you can access after 45 degrees. He couldn't get past 45 degrees on either side, but his right side was better than his left. If you can't get beyond 45 degrees of a straight leg raise, that tells me you have a lot of compression on the back side of your pelvis, and this goes hand in hand with him feeling like his glutes are really tight. In order for you to get beyond 45 degrees, you have to open up this back space in the pelvis right here, but if you have tightness or compression back there, that's not happening, and you're not going to get beyond 45 degrees without compensation. We also tested hip internal and external rotation, and these weren't terrible, but there were a couple of interesting things, most notably that his right hip external rotation was better than his left, and his left hip internal rotation was better than his right. Typically we see the inverse in the normal asymmetrical human pattern known as the left AIC, but if this left hip is really, really far forward, what tends to happen is it picks up internal rotation and it loses external rotation. So I wasn't too worried about it because he had so much tightness on both sides of his body and he was really forward on both sides. Oftentimes when you bring them back on both sides, you can then address the underlying asymmetry and things tend to make a little bit more sense. In terms of his upper body, his shoulders were pretty tight as I'd imagine. He had really limited internal rotation on both of his shoulders, which is a measurement of how tight the front side of your body is. And in terms of shoulder external rotation, which is a measurement of how tight the back side of your rib cage and shoulders are, he had more limited shoulder external rotation on his left side. We also measured shoulder abduction, which is a measurement of how well you can turn your trunk towards that side. It's also a measurement of how much compression you have on the back side of your rib cage and shoulder. And his right side was better than his left. The findings of these assessments suggest that he has a lot of tightness on both sides of his body, but he was really forward within his pelvis. The more forward you go, the more you're going to lose hip measurements and your straight leg raise. So he was really far forward in his pelvis, and you get to a certain point where if you're really far forward, your center of mass is being pushed onto your toes, you feel like you're falling too far forward subconsciously. So the muscles on the back side of your pelvis are gonna start to get really tight, and they're gonna prevent you from falling too far forward, and they're gonna pull you back like that. and that is represented in his straight leg raise and his chronically tight glutes. He also had a lot of tightness on both sides of his rib cage, but his shoulder internal rotation was much worse than his external rotation, which tells me that he has a lot of compression on the front side of his rib cage, which is pulling his rib cage down. And this is another way that if someone feels like they're falling too far forward, they can push this down to help them prevent themselves from doing that. And underneath all of this was a significantly more forward left hip than his right, but I'm not too worried about that because he has so much compression and tightness on both sides of his body. I need to bring him back on both sides within his pelvis and restore overall pelvic sagittal plane competency, meaning that the whole pelvis needs to be able to move back, and then we can address these underlying asymmetries at the pelvis and within the rib cage. In my biomechanics course, I have a 3-phase progression model that I teach, which gives specific, very clear instructions on what to address first when you're dealing with someone that has a lot of tightness. The first thing we need to do is be able to get him to have better than a 45-degree straight leg raise. We need to do that because that is going to allow him to shut off all this tightness he has on the backside of his pelvis, which will allow him, as he works on his hip extension, to then get into a more neutral pelvic position. Michael had a bit of a difficult time initially going through different movements and being able to feel comfortable when changes were made to his body. So we tried about 5 different exercises, and these are the 3 that we stuck with. We started off really easy with some gentle rolling, which helps get dissociation between sides of the pelvis. This helped him relax and shut down some of the tone and tightness in his pelvis he was carrying around with him all the time. So that way we can start to facilitate other muscles in other positions to help him regain the ability to bring his pelvis back on both sides. Now these TFLs needed to be addressed too, because anytime he would do hip extension work, he would feel those TFLs unable to let go. So we did an exercise from a video that I have where we inhibited the TFL, because the TFL creates hip flexion and internal rotation. We put him in a position of hip extension and external rotation to help shut off that muscle, and that was very, very helpful for him. We then followed that up with some work to help get him some external rotation back and posterior rotation of the pelvis with this hook lying hamstring bridge. We put a couple of dumbbells between his heels and his butt to allow him a reference to drag those heels back. By the end of the session, we had a lot of great changes. His Ober's test was clear on both sides. He had a way better straight leg raise. His femoral rotation measurements were significantly improved, and his shoulders were also looking much, much better. Now, because we have a semi-private training model at this gym, I'm bouncing around from client to client a lot of the times, so we didn't get to film everything. But I will link down below an article I'm writing alongside this video, which goes into more detail in terms of specifics and other weight room work we used to help facilitate better change and strengthen him over time. Now in the second week, what we did was we progressed a lot of his ground-based drills, but we also started to load him. Let's start with the drills first. In the second phase of my progression model, we want to clear the Ober's test on both sides. We want femoral rotation measurements to improve and the straight leg raise to be beyond 70 degrees. We also want to clear shoulder external and internal rotation to the extent at which we can, and shoulder abduction, because this means we have decompressed the body and increased movement options on both sides of the body, and now he has a way more neutral pelvis, and now we can start to address the underlying asymmetries within his body. The reason why we have to clear these other measurements first is because the human body has this natural bias towards asymmetry, which is buried deep within us. This is who we naturally are. As we start to add more layers of compensation, we tend to use muscles closer to the surface of our body, like our lats, back extensors, glutes, etc., which tend to be larger in nature, to hold us in positions that are compensatory. So it's like slicing through layers of a cake. In order to get to that underlying natural asymmetrical pattern, we have to decompress and reduce tone in the larger things closer to the surface of the body. At this point, his right straight leg raise was still better than his left. He also had better left hip flexion, and he also had more limited left shoulder abduction, which we had a more difficult time improving, which tells us that he has this natural asymmetrical pattern because his right hip internal rotation was now better than his left, and his left external rotation measurements were better than his right. And he also had more compression on the back side of his left rib cage, which is what we would expect in this pattern. We kept the TFL inhibition exercise in there as one of his 3 drills because we found if we took it out, his measurements would get worse and he'd feel those TFLs kick on again. So he needed more than a week to adapt to that exercise. We used an exercise that facilitates right hip external rotation and left hip internal rotation that we initially tried to use the first week, but he wasn't quite ready for it. But we then added it in the second week, and we had much more success because he was better able to control that neutral pelvis position as he went through this. We also did a seated alternating tricep extension activity because what I try to do first is improve the position of the rib cage. So we got the expansion from front to back, and now we use the triceps to help pull the scap down back on the rib cage better. Because this long head attaches on the lateral border of the scap, it helps pull it down and back. Now we also started to load him a little bit more. So we used an asymmetrical split squat setup. We used a contralateral load or opposite side load with his left foot forward and a same side load with his right foot forward, which would be an ipsilateral load. And because we naturally turn away from load, if I have a weight in my right hand and my left foot is forward, I'm naturally going to want to turn towards that left hip. And if I have a weight in my right hand with my right foot forward, I'm going to naturally turn away from that side. So this is all strategical in nature and trying to get him to shift left better. We also patterned better rowing mechanics. And we did a seated cable row because that's an easy position to start in. And I made sure he knew to lead with his elbow back rather than pulling his scap back like a lot of people initially do, because that's just going to jam and compress the scap against the rib cage and prevent that scap from going through a full range of motion as that elbow comes back. We want the elbow to lead the show in these rows. That's going to be much better for proper mechanical coupling of the shoulder and the humerus. By the third week, he was feeling much, much better, but things weren't perfect quite yet. So if that's the case, what I will do is I will progress them to a different type of test, which integrates the ability for someone to push out of one side and shift effectively into the other. There are 5 levels to this test, and generally the first 3 are the hardest to do. Because he was already making such great progress, he was able to pass the first and second level of the test pretty effectively, which means that he could lift his foot all the way up to his top leg, and he could lift his knee off of the ground and feel the muscles that help pull him over to the left, like the left glute med and the left adductor. The reason why his head is slightly side bent to one side is because when we shift over to one side, the head tends to tilt towards the other side when we are in stance phase of gait on that side. I'll be honest, because I was looking at him from a downstream view, I couldn't see how much his head was tilted, and we realized it was a little too much, so we eventually turned the yoga block down, and that was much better. But he couldn't get his hips off of the table and keep all of that together because the obliques, left adductor, left glute med, help pull us over to that side. He couldn't integrate those things together quite effectively enough yet. So we did an exercise called the foot toward foot, which incorporated a lot of that left internal rotation with right hip external rotation. What we gave him was an exercise that helps facilitate the left glute med and the left adductor with the left obliques together in this right side lying position right here. This was very helpful for him. Now I like to get people upright as soon as possible, but for some people we need to spend a little bit more time on the ground as they get comfortable. What we did for the third exercise was a banded single leg step down. That band is pulling his leg out, so it's a reference for him to keep his leg in. This is a really good way for people to sense and integrate the left glute med, left adductor, and those left obliques together as they go through it. We also started to progress some of his split squats. So we added a front foot elevation on the left because that helps him better shift over to the left side. On the right side, we used a banded reference, which is pulling the knee in, so he has to push the knee out for better integration of right hip external rotation and the muscles associated with it. By the end of the day, he was able to get his hips off of the table while feeling the left abs, left adductor, and left glute med. But in order to get to a level 4, you need to be able to get your hips all the way to the level of my shoulder. So by week 4, things were really great, but he still had a little bit of right neck tension, and he still had a harder time integrating his right glute and muscles of external rotation with muscles of left hip internal rotation in more challenging positions. So what we did was I gave him one of my favorite integrated activities, which looks very similar to the test. This exercise is working to have him hold right hip external rotation and abduction, and lifting up the left knee, which is internal rotation on that down side on the left. And he was going to sit there and integrate those things together. And what we found ultimately was that his right lat was still just a little tight, so we gave him a basic lat release, and that helped improve his shoulder and neck tremendously. And the last thing that we sent him on his way with was a left stance reciprocating step through. So this is having him shift over to the left, hold left stance, and then bring his right leg back and forth. By the time he left, he was a level 4, and for a lot of people, they feel really, really good before that, but some people need to progress through this test to get those finishing touches. We progressed his exercises in the weight room with more load, and we sent him on his way with a full program that he can do at home. So to summarize, because he had so much tightness on both sides of his body, his pelvis was forward on both sides, but so forward that his glutes were gripping to prevent him from falling too far forward, and he was gripping his six-pack abs so that he wouldn't fall too far forward. Also, that helps bring him down here. We needed to decompress all of this initially, get him to be able to be less stiff overall on both sides of the body. We brought him back on both sides, got him to expand his rib cage from front to back very effectively. And then underlying that, he still had a more forward left hip. So we did things to integrate his ability to shift out of his right side into external rotation and shift over to the left and be able to turn his rib cage to the left more effectively as well. Now, I hope that was really helpful, and I'm glad I was able to share a case like Michael, because a lot of the times humans are complex and they have a lot of issues going on, but this is what real life looks like when we're integrating these principles. So because you stuck around to the end of this video, I know you're probably more serious about learning how to do these things and implementing these strategies. So I'm offering a special discount code exclusively for you. You can use the code CASESTUDY1 at checkout to get 20% off of either my beginner biomechanics course or my main biomechanics course. I have a live biomechanics course coming in November of 2022. I believe this is the best option because with the live course, you get exclusive practical application sessions which go over exactly how you can coach and cue the exercises and assessments, but also you get way more access to me in terms of a Slack chat and just overall more live interaction. But if you can't make the live calls, then you still have the Slack chat where we have an amazing amount of discussion on there, as well as case studies, questions asked, and just overall discussion that's really beneficial for everyone in.